Billionaire comes home early to find his wife beating his black adoptive mother. What would happen next? As the charcoal gray Tesla glided silently into the arched driveway of the $30 million estate in Santa Barbara, Michael Reed had only one thought in mind: to surprise the woman who had shaped the man he had become. 19 days spent winding through the technology cities of Japan, negotiating the largest investment deal in his company's history, had left Michael exhausted yet quietly eager. Not eager for champagne celebrations, nor for the cool luxury of the infinity pool that overlooked the Pacific Ocean. But for her, Clara Jenkins. Not his birth mother, no, but in every way that mattered, she was his mother. She had taken him in when he was a 10-year-old boy, abandoned in a foster facility in Birmingham, Alabama, where no one wanted a child who was both scrawny and silent. And now, with her 67th birthday just behind them, Michael was determined to bring her home to live with him, the only real family he had ever known. Out of honor, out of a love that had never wavered. As the car came to a stop at the foot of the side steps leading to the auxiliary entrance, Michael turned off the engine, slipped off his sunglasses, and allowed himself a faint smile. Chamomile tea with honey, he whispered to himself, recalling those afternoons when he came home from elementary school in tears and she would brew him a warm cup, gently pat his back and say, "It's okay, sweetheart. Tomorrow will be better." He stepped out, circled quietly toward the back entrance that opened into the spacious kitchen where he intended to make that same familiar tea for her with his own hands. But what he heard brought his steps to an abrupt halt just behind the white marble column. "How many times have I told you not to use the main door when I have guests?" The voice was sharp as a blade, each word falling cold and hard. It was Vanessa, his wife. Then, another voice, weaker, shaky, yet more familiar than any sound in the world, Clara's voice. I'm sorry, Mrs. Vanessa, I didn't mean to. You're just the help here, not the lady of the house, no matter what strange obsession my husband has with you." Michael's heart slowed, as if his blood had frozen mid-pulse. The key in his hand slipped from his grasp and landed silently on the thick rug. The help? No, that couldn't be. Clara was not the help. She was his mother, the reason he could stand tall in the world. But what he saw, as he gently leaned out from behind the column, shattered something deep within him. Clara, her silver-gray hair neatly pinned back, stood motionless in a pale blue cleaning uniform, hands wrapped around a steaming teacup, her head bowed before a woman in a designer dress with golden bracelets at her wrist. She did not deserve this, not in the very home she had once kept vigil through long hospital nights to afford the tuition that allowed a boy. Nobody wanted to feel he belonged, not in this very kitchen where she used to wake at dawn to bake banana bread, because she knew he loved how it reminded him of home. And now, the woman who had given everything so he could walk through life with his head held high was reduced to a shadow, humiliated, controlled, treated as if she had no worth at all. Michael's hands curled tightly into fists, but he didn't step forward. Not yet, not out of fear, but because he knew, with a clarity that chilled him to the bone, this was only the beginning. This story is only just beginning, and what's about to unfold will hold you captive in ways you might not expect. But before we continue, if you're listening right now and feel your heart stir even just a little, whether from love, from a sense of injustice, or simply from wanting to know what happens next, take a moment to subscribe to Emotional Echoes. Here, we share real stories, stories that resonate deeply with the lives of adults, especially those who have loved, who have sacrificed, who have been hurt, and yet still choose to love again. If you're tuning in from a distant city or a quiet countryside, leave the name of your hometown in the comments. We'd love to know where this story has found its way and whose heart it has touched. And if you feel this story deserves to be heard, don't forget to like and share it with friends and loved ones. Now, let us return to that cold, echoing kitchen in the Santa Barbara estate, where the truth has only just begun to reveal itself. Michael stood frozen behind the marble column, his breath caught tight in his chest. The faint scent of chamomile still lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp tension that Vanessa's voice had carved into the room. Just moments earlier, he had imagined quietly brewing a cup of tea with his own hands, hoping to surprise Clara. That image now vanished, as if it had evaporated with the steam from a porcelain cup. Vanessa leaned against the granite kitchen counter, her perfectly made-up face immobile, not betraying the slightest flicker of emotion, the half-smile curling at her lips and a chill crawling down Michael's spine. Clara stood hunched, like a shadow pushed into the corner by the weight of the light itself. She still held the teacup, but the liquid inside had spilled over the rim, dripping onto the floor in a thin trail that she hurried to wipe up, her hands trembling so violently that she had to grip the edge of the counter just to steady herself. Vanessa glanced at the spill with a flicker of disgust in her eyes. Her voice was cold even, like someone reading a report that had nothing to do with her. Please be more careful. I don't want to have to call a professional cleaning service on a Saturday morning just because you can't hold a cup. Clara lowered her gaze. I'm sorry, Mrs. Vanessa. I'll clean it right away. Her voice was so faint that Michael, standing just a few steps away, barely heard it. Vanessa folded her arms, making no move to assist. Instead, she flicked her hair to the side and continued in that same detached tone. Why is it you always appear exactly when I have guests? Last week you walked past the living room in those wrinkled pajamas. My friend saw you. She gave a little laugh, light and sharp like broken glass. I had to explain you were new staff, still adjusting. Michael could feel the blood in his body beginning to boil, but he still didn't move. Not yet. He needed to hear more. He needed to know what had been happening in this house while he was away. Clara lifted her head just slightly, just enough for Michael to catch the glint of deep hurt in her eyes. She replied, her voice hoarse, like someone holding on to the last strands of dignity. I didn't mean to disturb anyone. I just thought I'd go out and get the mail, then go back to my room. Vanessa laughed again, a sound brittle and cutting. The mail. Did you forget that area is part of the shared space? If you want mail, you should ask someone to bring it to you. Housekeepers don't just wander around wherever they like. Housekeepers. That word surfaced again, a blade driven deeper into Michael's chest. Clara, who had spent her life caring for him, who cooked every meal in their little Alabama home, who once sold her last pair of earrings to pay for his first coding course, was now being dismissed as hired help. No, it was worse than that. She was treated like a burden, an embarrassment, someone Vanessa didn't want her wealthy friends to see. Clara set the teacup down, but her hand shook so badly it clinked softly against the countertop. Vanessa shot her a glare. Can you please not break things? Even if you're not the one paying for them, I still want to keep the house presentable. Clara's voice caught in her throat. I'm sorry. I just wanted to make some tea for Michael. He likes chamomile. Vanessa cut in immediately, her tone laced with mockery. Michael? Have you forgotten he's my husband, not your son? You act like you're his real mother or something. Michael's hands clenched, but not just out of anger. It was pain. Pain at hearing the woman who had raised him being humiliated by someone he had once trusted. Clara said nothing. Her silence felt like a tightening hand around Michael's throat. Then Vanessa spoke again, and what she said next told Michael that this wasn't new, that it had been going on far longer than he had imagined. If you still want to live here, then remember your place. This is my house, not yours. And I don't want to see you wandering around like you belong here. No defense, no compassion, only contempt, cold and calculated. Clara bowed her head deeply. I understand. I'm sorry for being a bother. Michael could barely breathe. Those words, the way Clara stood, that uniform, it all painted a truth he had refused to see. This wasn't a misunderstanding, not something that happened once or twice. This was a pattern, a deliberate diminishing, a cruelty practiced like routine. He brought a hand to his chest, feeling the heavy, dragging beat of his heart. He had once believed he knew Vanessa, but the woman standing in that kitchen was not the woman he had married, not someone he could still believe had a good heart. And then she said one more thing, one line that pushed everything past the edge. You should be grateful I even let you stay here. Without me, no one would want to house an old black woman from poor Alabama. Michael heard those words, and in that moment, he knew. Everything had changed, and nothing would ever go back to the way it was. Michael stood still in the shadow behind the stone pillar, as if by refusing to move, he might somehow stop time itself. But memory does not wait. It swept over him, fast and fierce like the southern storms of his childhood, pulling him backward into a past he had never truly left behind. The first time he saw her. Clara Jenkins. She was already in her 40s then, her sun-worn face soft, her hair neatly tied back at the nape of her neck. When Michael was 10, the foster home in Birmingham had been his last stop, after being turned away by 4 other families. He was thin, quiet, prone to waking up in the middle of the night with nightmares. No one wanted a white boy with averted eyes and a file filled with more sorrow than promise. But Clara had been different. She hadn't come looking for a child to raise. She came looking for someone to love. And she chose him. No conditions, no hesitation, just a boy sitting alone at the end of a hallway with torn shoes. She knelt down and asked, "Are you cold? Not how old are you? Not do you behave? Not are you smart? Just, are you cold?" It was the first time anyone had asked him something not to assess, but to care. Clara's house sat on the southern edge of Birmingham, where the roads were still red dirt and the musty scent of aged wood lingered in every wall. But to Michael, it was heaven. Clara didn't have much. She lived on a modest nurse's pension and occasionally cared for the sick in their homes. But she always had the things that mattered most to give. A hot meal at dinner, a pair of arms to hold him when fear clawed him awake, and the endless patience to help a wounded boy believe he wouldn't be abandoned again. He remembered, clear as day, the first time she took him to the city library. She said, "Pick any book you like." Whether it was about programming, astronomy, or adventures in faraway lands, she would sit and read it with him, even as her aging eyes began to strain. When he wanted to learn guitar, she saved for 3 months to buy a used one from a nearby church. When he said he wanted to learn how to code, she took extra night shifts at the nursing home to cover the tuition for weekend classes. She never called any of it sacrifice. To her, it was simply what a mother does when her child finds something that brings them joy. Eddie Todd, 14. When Michael won the state computer science competition, she was the first to rush on stage and hold him, weeping not from pride, but from relief. Relief that he had finally started to believe in himself. That same year, he called her Mom for the first time. No one asked him to, no one reminded him. It was just one quiet night over a simple dinner of chicken soup and toasted bread. He set down his bowl and said, "Thank you, Mom." Clara froze for a moment. She didn't ask him to repeat it. She only smiled, tears rolling down her cheeks, then stood and fetched him another slice of bread. Her love had never been loud. It lived in the socks she washed by hand, in the nights she stayed awake holding him through fevers, in the way she listened to every wild business idea he had at 18, as though he were unveiling a master plan to change the world. When Michael finally succeeded, when he became one of the founding forces behind a powerful tech investment fund on the West Coast, he never forgot what had built the foundation beneath him. Not the university, not the early capital. It was Clara. She hadn't taught him how to calculate profits. She taught him how to listen, how to keep his word, how never to turn away from the person who had walked with him through the mud. So when he bought the estate in Santa Barbara, nearly 1,000 square meters overlooking the ocean, he didn't hesitate. He invited Clara to live with him, not as a guest, as the woman of the house. She had her own room, a small garden for herbs, and a long wooden bench where she could sit and read each afternoon. He believed she was safe, believed that after all those years she was finally living in peace, surrounded by love. But what he had just witnessed shattered that belief. Vanessa hadn't simply insulted her. She had desecrated something sacred, the quiet dignity of the woman who had saved him from the dark, and something in Michael stirred, not a burst of anger, something deeper, quieter, and far more certain. An old promise was rising from the depths, and this time he would not let anyone lay a hand on his mother ever again. She had once lived in an old wooden house on the southern outskirts of Birmingham, where summer pressed down heavy and breathless, and winter slipped through the cracked walls with a chill that bit at your bones. The house had just 2 bedrooms, its paint peeled away by time, and the roof, patched with tin after a storm many years ago, groaned under the weight of memory. Yet it was here that Clara Jenkins had spent nearly her whole life, and it was here that her love had taken root, like a quiet flame, burning low but constant through hardship, never once fading. She had been a nurse at a public hospital, working the wards for 30 years until her back began to ache, and she walked with a limp after a fall in the emergency room hallway. After retiring, she cared for elderly patients in their homes, not for money, but because stillness never suited her. To Clara, the elderly deserved to be tended to like children, with gentleness and patience. Yet, there was a hollow space inside her heart, something even work could not fill. She had no children of her own. Her late husband, a steel mill worker, had passed from lung cancer when she was barely in her 30s. They had once dreamed of a full home, but life had given them something else. Her loneliness lingered, quiet and unspoken, until one October afternoon, when she passed by a foster care center downtown to visit an old friend. She hadn't meant to adopt, but she stopped when she saw a boy sitting alone on a bench, his shoes torn through, fingers clasped together, eyes fixed on the cold tile floor. She sat beside him and asked gently if he was cold. The boy didn't speak, but when she placed a hand lightly on his back, he didn't pull away. And that was how the journey began. She brought him home. The beginning was hard. He barely spoke, never made eye contact, and would wake with a start in the middle of the night, shivering from nightmares. She didn't ask questions. She was simply there. Every day without fail, she made breakfast, tied his shoes, and laid out the softest blanket on the couch. Each time he trembled with fear, she sat beside him, saying nothing, just placing her hand on his shoulder as if to say, "You're not alone anymore." Gradually, he began to speak. At first just yes or no, then questions about the guitar sitting in the corner of the living room, and one day he asked, "Mom, can you teach me how to cook?" Clara smiled. He had called her Mom, just one word. But to her, it was the greatest gift life had ever given. From that day forward, her old wooden house no longer felt small. It echoed with laughter, carried the scent of vegetable soup Michael loved, and rang each evening with the soft, earnest notes he strummed on that old guitar. She still worked hard, took on long hours to care for them both, but never once complained. And when people asked why she didn't rest at her age, she would say, "I'm raising a boy who's going to change the world." And she believed it with all her heart. When Michael earned a university scholarship, she was the one who waited outside the auditorium for 3 long hours, just to hug him when he stepped out the door. When his first business idea fell apart, she baked banana bread and told him, "The first failure is life's way of greeting those brave enough to dream big." And then Michael succeeded. The quiet, guarded boy grew into a man whose net worth soared into the hundreds of millions. But in Clara's eyes, he was still the child who once trembled at the sound of thunder. So when he asked her to come live with him in Santa Barbara, she declined the first time. She said she was used to her little house, but Michael came in person, knelt in the yard, held her hands and said, "It's time I take care of you." And she cried. The seaside estate she moved into did not make her feel like a grand lady of wealth, but she thought, at the very least, she could plant her rosemary again. She could make her son tea each morning. Care for him in the small ways only a mother who has lost everything understands to be sacred. She thought it would be the final chapter of her life. A peaceful chapter, a well-earned gift after the long road behind her. But now, standing there, trembling in the polished kitchen, facing Vanessa's cruel words, Clara understood that peace is never easily won. And sometimes, the past must step into the light to remind people that love is not something to be hidden away in a basement like an old box of things no longer needed. Not when someone who shared that love is standing close enough to see. Not when the son she raised with every beat of her heart had just witnessed everything in silence. The cleaning uniform on Clara's body tightened around Michael's throat like a hand closing in, cutting off his breath. It wasn't the soft clothes she usually wore at home, nor the pale floral dress she often put on when tending to her herb garden in the late afternoons. It was a pale blue uniform, the kind handed out to housekeeping staff at roadside motels, the collar washed nearly white, the sleeve seams fraying with age. But what broke Michael more than the uniform itself was how Clara wore it. Her back curved inward, as if trying to make herself smaller, her narrow shoulders drawn up, trembling, as though fear had settled there permanently. Her hands fumbled at the hem of her shirt, too afraid to tuck them away, too fragile to let them hang. Her eyes never lifted, not for a second. She stood like someone who had learned to obey, learned to submit, learned that silence was the only way to stay out of trouble. This was not the Clara he knew. His Clara stood tall in the face of injustice, even though she barely stood 5'2". His Clara had once argued with a supermarket manager who treated black customers unfairly. His Clara had taken his hand and told him, "When you bow to what's wrong, you give someone else the power to tell you who you are." But the woman standing in front of Vanessa now was no longer that Clara. And that was how Michael knew this wasn't just some one-off incident. It was the aftermath of days, of weeks, perhaps even months of erosion. No one changes their posture overnight. Only someone who has been pushed to the very brink of fear would stand the way Clara was standing now. Michael's eyes drifted to her ankles, where the loose pants of her uniform bunched at the hem. She had likely tried to fold them, but still, they didn't fit. Clara was small, but in his eyes she had always stood taller than anyone. That image had now been twisted, crushed under a quiet and calculated cruelty. Vanessa stood with her arms folded, leaning against the marble countertop as if enjoying the performance. There was no pity in her eyes, no hesitation. Only the satisfaction of someone who had grown used to control, to commanding silence, to assigning people's worth by the shade of their skin and the rung of the ladder they stood on. She spoke, her voice light as a breeze but sharp as a blade. "That uniform suits you better. Before, when you tried to dress like family, it always looked so forced." Michael drew in a breath, his hand clenching so tightly his knuckles turned white. Clara didn't answer. Her head bowed lower, as if she wished she could disappear entirely. Vanessa went on. "You should be grateful I helped you find your place. Not everyone gets to live in a house like this, even if it's only as cleaning staff." Each word fell like stone into still water, shattering whatever calm remained in Michael's chest. He saw how Clara reached to button the top of her uniform, hiding the faint bruise near the base of her neck. A bruise she had never spoken of. A bruise she must have hidden for weeks. He saw it now, clearly, and it broke something deep inside him. Vanessa didn't know he was standing there. She didn't know her words were slicing through the most vulnerable part of Michael's being. Clara was not a maid. She was the reason he existed. And still Vanessa continued, as if correcting a misbehaving child. "From now on, you're only to use the basement bathroom. I don't want my guests thinking I let the help share the house's amenities. I don't want them to feel uncomfortable." Clara nodded faintly. Not with agreement, but in surrender. The kind of nod that says, "I know I've lost." Michael closed his eyes for a single second, long enough to remember the way Clara had held him when he was 12, long enough to recall how she had shielded him from every unfair blow the world had dealt, long enough to realize that the woman who once stood between him and every storm was now left to face one alone. The luxury kitchen, gleaming under designer lights, now felt like a stage set for cruelty. Vanessa, the director without compassion, and Clara, the silent figure stripped of everything but her dignity, reduced to playing a role that never belonged to her. That was the truth Michael could not forgive, not simply because it was cruel, but because it was happening here. In the home he had promised would be a sanctuary for his mother. And in that moment, as Clara's hands trembled once more, Michael knew with unshakable clarity, this was the final line. And Vanessa, blind to everything but her own pride, had just stepped over it. Michael did not step out from his hiding place. He remained still behind the stone pillar, silent as a shadow. But not out of fear, not out of hesitation. He stood there because he knew that anger, if unleashed now, would only scatter everything into chaos. Vanessa would cry. She would play the wounded one, twist the narrative with the same sweet excuses she had mastered at charity galas and glossy magazine interviews. And Clara, who had borne it all, would be left shouldering the blame for creating tension in the household. No, he would not allow that. Not this time. So he chose silence, but his eyes had seen everything. Every time his mother bowed her head, every faded bruise on her wrist that others might dismiss as age. Every sharp glance, every cruel word from Vanessa, wielded like a scalpel cloaked in silk. Each detail etched itself into his mind, vivid and permanent. He had witnessed cruelty that never needed to scream to be devastating, a kind of quiet violence that crushed a person's dignity without ever raising its voice. He had seen how his mother had learned to survive by becoming invisible, and he had seen how absent he had been. He had called, sent flowers, arranged spa visits and in-home doctors through assistants, but he had not seen what truly unfolded behind the cold marble walls of the house he once believed to be a sanctuary. To the world, Vanessa was still the perfect woman. She knew how to behave, how to speak just deeply enough to sound thoughtful, how to smile on cue and decline with grace. But Michael no longer saw her that way. He saw someone else now, someone precise with her cruelty, skilled at cloaking contempt in courtesy, cold enough to turn humiliation into softly spoken rules. And what he could not forgive was that this charade had existed for months in the same space his mother lived, and he had never noticed. Clara remained silent even after Vanessa left, her heels tapping against the marble floor like a fading drumbeat of domination. She bent down, picked up the fallen cloth, and wiped away the remaining tea as though it were the only thing she still had control over in this house. When she turned to leave the kitchen, Michael gently backed deeper into the shadows, his heart pounding but his face composed. He didn't want her to know he had seen this, not yet. He needed more. He needed the whole truth. Part of him wanted to rush forward and hold her tightly, to beg her forgiveness for not being there. But another part, the more disciplined part, understood that any emotional move now would reveal too much too soon. And Vanessa, so practiced in manipulation, would never let it pass unchallenged. Michael turned and walked slowly toward the path leading to the back garden. He knew Clara would return to her room. She would likely sit quietly by the window, the one that looked out over the lavender trellis she had planted the year before. She would not speak to him about this, because she believed he was too busy, because she didn't want to cause trouble, because she had lived a lifetime believing that endurance was her only armor. But Michael was no longer the boy who feared the dark and hid behind her. He was now a man with the power to change the course of everything. And more than that, he was the only son Clara had ever chosen, the child she had raised with her whole heart. He stepped into the yard, lifted his gaze to the soft blue sky, stretching over Santa Barbara, trying to find his breath again. The sunlight still filtered gently through the olive trees. But within him, a storm was already forming. It was not the kind of storm born from rage alone. It was a plan, precise and quiet, shaped by everything his eyes had now seen. Because some wounds do not need to be screamed to be heard. They only need to be witnessed by someone with clear sight. And now, his eyes were wide open. This story is not over. It has only just begun. Michael walked slowly along the stone path behind the house, his leather shoes silent against the earth while his mind spun relentlessly with the images he had just witnessed. Vanessa's ice-cold voice, the cleaning uniform draped over Clara's small frame, his mother's lowered gaze, all of it replayed in his mind like a film he could not turn off. A light breeze rolled in from the western sea, stirring the rosemary bushes and carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and jasmine, the flowers Clara had planted herself with those fragile, trembling hands. He paused in front of the long wooden bench shaded beneath the tree, the very spot where, each morning, his mother would sit with her tea and reread the worn pages of old books. Just a few months ago, he'd sat beside her here, exchanging quiet bits of conversation, letting the silence between them say all the things that didn't need to be spoken. But today, everything felt different. And as he looked down at the weathered wood, another memory returned clearer than it had been in years. It was a winter afternoon. He had been 12. The school had descended into chaos after a group of older boys pushed him to the ground behind the cafeteria. They didn't use his name. They used words that any child would understand meant he didn't belong. Foster kid, parentless, white trash living off pity. Michael couldn't remember how far he ran, only that when he finally stopped, he was sitting in a vacant lot behind a church, alone. He had stayed there until the sky darkened. Clara was the one who found him. She didn't ask who had hurt him. She didn't scold him for leaving school. She simply sat beside him, wrapped an arm around his shoulder, and said, "You know, people hurt others when they're afraid. They fear what they don't understand. But that doesn't mean you have to fear them." Michael looked up at her then, eyes red and swollen. I just want to be like everyone else. I don't want to be called Foster. Clara squeezed his shoulder gently. But you are Foster, and that doesn't make you less than anyone else. It makes you chosen, it makes you loved. And then she said the words he never forgot. One day when you're grown and strong enough, you'll protect people like me, the ones no one sees, the ones pushed out of the room just because they don't fit someone else's idea of what belongs. You won't let them be silent like I once was. Michael hadn't answered. He'd only nodded. But in his heart, a promise had taken root that day, growing quietly through every season of his life. Now, standing in the well-manicured garden of a Santa Barbara estate, surrounded by beauty so carefully designed it almost masked the truth, Michael knew that moment had come. This was when the boy who once made that promise would have to become the man who kept it. He couldn't rewind time, couldn't erase the bitter words his mother had been forced to hear, couldn't undo the shame she had carried quietly day after day. But he could stop it. He could make sure it never happened again. And he could, with every ounce of strength and clarity he possessed, make the person who had inflicted that pain understand just how deeply they had misjudged the man Clara Jenkins had raised. Michael sat down on the bench, his fingers brushing across the time-worn wood as if reaching for his mother's hand. He thought of the nights she stayed awake at his bedside, the times she ignored her own aching bones after 12-hour shifts just to make him a hot meal, the first pair of shoes she ever bought him from a second-hand store, the surgery she put off because she wanted to pay for his first coding class instead. None of those things were in any article, no magazine had written about them, but they were the very foundation of his life, and that was why he could not allow anyone to tarnish them. Vanessa might think Clara had been silent, that no one had noticed, but she was wrong. Michael had seen. And he remembered. Every word, every bruise, every breath his mother had swallowed to keep peace in a home that should have offered her nothing but comfort. He rose slowly, taking a deep breath as if trying to contain the storm building inside. The sun had begun to fall, casting long, narrow beams through the olive branches like whispers from the past, tracing their way down his back. And he knew, all silence has its threshold. That threshold had now been reached, and from here on, the one who would rise was him, not just because he was Clara's son, but because he had made a promise. And that promise had never been forgotten. Returning to his study on the second floor, where the glass doors overlooked the herb garden Clara tended each day, Michael closed the door behind him and turned the lock. The room was soundproofed, silent as a sealed vault, separating him completely from the rest of the house. He switched on the desk lamp, its golden glow casting a warm, steady light, and took a seat before the wide screen in the corner. The air felt heavier here, thick with everything unsaid. With deliberate motion, Michael opened the internal security system app, one only he had access to. The layout of the house appeared on the screen, each section monitored by discreetly placed cameras. The kitchen, the hallways, the main foyer, the living room, the garage, even the back garden. Vanessa had no idea the system had been upgraded 3 months earlier, after Michael had received cyber threats during an event in New York. The new system did more than record video. It archived high-quality audio, capable of capturing even the faintest whisper. He pulled up the archive list, scrolled back to the day he boarded his flight to Japan, and began to watch. What unfolded on the screen stole the breath from his lungs. On the first day after his departure, Vanessa entered the kitchen to find Clara baking banana bread, Michael's favorite since childhood. Vanessa stood behind her, arms crossed, watching for a long moment before asking, "What are you doing?" Clara turned, her voice light with a quiet happiness. "I thought I'd bake a little banana bread so Michael would have something warm when he gets back." Vanessa gave a dry laugh, looked her up and down, then said, "Do you really think he cares about what you bake? He's not that poor little boy from your wooden house anymore. That was the first day." But it wasn't the last. On the third day, Clara carried a pitcher of water into the main living room, where one of Vanessa's guests was playing cards. Vanessa snapped, "Who told you to come in here? This isn't your space. From now on, don't enter unless I'm present." Clara simply nodded and turned away, her shoulders trembling with the weight of humiliation. On the 6th day, Clara accidentally left a note on the kitchen counter, a reminder with the doctor's phone number. Vanessa picked it up, crushed it in her hand, and later, when Clara asked about the call, said flatly, "No one phoned. You must be confused." During the second week, footage from the dining room forced Michael to pause the video. His hands were shaking. Clara sat alone in the small auxiliary kitchen, eating from a cold plate. Meanwhile, Vanessa and her guests dined in the grand dining room, sipping wine and enjoying hors d'oeuvres prepared by the private chef. At one point, when a guest asked who Clara was, Vanessa replied without hesitation, "That's my husband's old housekeeper. She lives here because he pities her, but please try not to let her disturb you." A week before Michael's return, Clara prepared a special dinner. She cooked chicken stew, the dish he had loved most as a boy. She set candles on the table, wrote his name in icing on a small handmade cake. The video showed her carefully folding napkins, adjusting the glasses as though preparing for a celebration. Then Vanessa entered. She stared for a moment and asked, "What is all this?" Clara smiled. "Today marks 20 years since I adopted Michael. I thought we could celebrate." Vanessa laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. An old black woman from Alabama throwing a party because she thinks she's the mother of a white millionaire. That's rich. Then she reached forward, knocked over the candle, and swept the entire meal cake, candles, cloth, everything into the trash, and she told Clara to clean it up. Now. Clara didn't argue. She picked up each napkin, folded it, wiped the table like a servant. Later, she took a broken piece of cake down to the basement and ate in silence. A hallway camera showed her sitting on a plastic chair, clutching the small plate, eating slowly, as if afraid the sound of chewing might disturb someone upstairs. Michael watched it all, one clip after another, each word, each look, each calculated gesture, the insults, the isolation, the repetition of a script that Vanessa had rehearsed to perfection. He sat there, his body numb, his soul burning. Everything he had believed to be peaceful in this home was nothing more than a thin coat of paint over something brutal and unspoken. Clara had lived in silence, and in that silence she had been diminished, pushed aside, made invisible in the very house built from her sacrifice. But now every image, every word had been recorded, and they would stand as witnesses to a truth no one would deny. The mask had fallen. The cruelty had shape. There was no going back. Michael knew what he had to do next. It wasn't just about shielding his mother from further harm. It was about making sure the one who caused it was held accountable. Not with rage, not with vengeance, but with truth and with justice. Michael watched the footage again, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps part of him hoped he had exaggerated it in his mind, that the cruelty hadn't been as sharp, the humiliation not quite so deliberate. But the second viewing didn't soften the pain. It deepened it. What he saw wasn't anger distorted by emotion. It was truth, cold and unblinking, captured in high definition and sealed in silence. It began with a tenderness that made his chest ache. Clara had dressed in a gray dress. He recognized a piece she always kept carefully folded in the back of her closet for rare occasions. Her hair had been brushed and pinned back with an old clip. She laid a white tablecloth on the small wooden table in the auxiliary kitchen and gently placed porcelain plates, crystal glasses, and pale yellow-scented candles one by one, her hands moving with care and purpose. From the ceiling-mounted camera, he could see her pause to straighten a napkin, smoothing the crease until it was perfectly aligned. On the table was chicken stew with vegetables, the dish she used to make him in his school years, and a small white cake with uneven, slightly shaky icing that read, "Happy day you came to me." The handwriting was wobbly, imperfect, but no message had ever been clearer. Clara stepped back, looked at the table, and smiled softly. She picked up a faded photo from the edge of the table. He remembered that photo well. It was the day she adopted him. Her eyes glistened, but there was no sadness there, only the quiet light of a woman who had waited her whole life for this kind of moment. But the moment didn't last. The kitchen door burst open. Vanessa walked in briskly, phone in hand, her flawlessly made-up face tightening at the sight of the table. She stopped, scanned the room, and asked sharply, "What's going on in here?" Clara turned to her, still wearing the smile of someone trying to offer something kind. Today is the anniversary of the day I adopted Michael. I just thought I'd celebrate a little." Vanessa scoffed and walked toward the cake. She picked up a paring knife, glanced down at the handwritten icing with disdain, and said, "You seriously think Michael needs this? He's in Japan, closing a deal worth hundreds of millions. He doesn't have time for these sentimental leftovers." Clara's smile faded. She said nothing. Vanessa leaned in closer to the cake, reading the words like they were a bad joke. "You really think he's your son? You? An old black woman from Alabama. You were paid to take care of a boy no one else wanted. You're not his mother. You're part of a past he's moved on from." And then, with no hesitation, Vanessa dropped the cake into the trash. It landed with a heavy, muffled thud, frosting and sponge splattering against the plastic bag. Clara flinched. Her eyes widened, but she didn't speak. She only let out a breath, bent down, and picked up the empty plate, her hand trembling. Vanessa turned and left without another word. Michael watched his mother clean, alone, in silence. The candles extinguished, frosting smeared across the table like a scar, the quiet joy she had prepared reduced to mess and shame. Clara washed the dishes slowly, carefully, wiping each glass and folding each napkin as though restoring order might erase what had just happened. Then she opened the refrigerator, took out a cold sandwich, and placed it on one of the now clean plates. She carried it downstairs. The hallway camera showed her descending the steps to the basement, no one following, no music, no comfort. Only the sound of slow footsteps and the dim glow of hallway light leading her down. In the basement, the footage captured her sitting on a plastic chair, plate in hand but not eating right away. She set the plate down on the table beside her, unclipped her hair, letting the silver strands fall over her shoulders. She sighed. A long, tired sigh that said more than words ever could. Then, slowly, she picked up the sandwich and took a bite, chewing carefully, as if the very act of eating had become something she didn't want to be heard. Michael stopped the video on the final frame. His heart felt strangled. This was Clara, his Clara, the woman who had stood tall against a world that once tried to crush both of them, the woman who had fought through grief, through labor, through loneliness, so that he could one day stand tall. Now she was sitting alone in a basement, eating in silence like a stranger in a house she had helped build with her love, just because she had dared to love him as a mother. And Michael understood beyond all doubt that this had gone far past disrespect. This was no longer about boundaries or class or misunderstanding. This was targeted, intentional, a pattern of quiet, precise humiliation, the most insidious kind of emotional abuse, the kind done in soft tones, with practiced smiles, behind closed doors. He would not let it continue. Not while he still had breath in his body, not while she still called him son. After watching every second of the footage, Michael felt as though he had just stepped out of a nightmare with no end. But the deeper the pain sank into his chest, the clearer his mind became. This wasn't just a matter between a wife and a foster mother. It wasn't a family misunderstanding. What he had uncovered was deliberate, step-by-step, day-by-day cruelty, possibly orchestrated by more than just Vanessa. Michael sat silently in his office, the heavy quiet pressing in around him, then reopened the security suite designed by his private team of technicians. From there, he began extracting data from an old phone Vanessa used as a secondary device, the one she often left in her dressing room while at the spa or lunching with her circle of friends. That device, long overlooked, became the key to a hidden world, a side of her he had never seen so clearly. In her message history, one chat group stood out, Santa Barbara Prestige Circle. The name sounded innocuous enough, a club for refined women, educated and elegant, living within the manicured borders of this privileged neighborhood. But the deeper Michael read, the colder his blood became. Within that thread, Vanessa often shared details about Clara not as a human being, but as if she were some bothersome old pet, something to be tolerated, joked about, dismissed. The messages were laced with sarcasm, laughter emojis, and cruelty wrapped in the polite language of social status. A woman named Judith, the wife of the local bank president, wrote, "Clara still remembers your husband's name. You might want to check her memory. Wouldn't want her making insurance claims with the wrong forms. Vanessa replied. She was mumbling to Michael's photo last night, calling him her sweet baby boy. The group laughed, piling on. Patricia, heiress to the region's largest real estate empire, added, I had to send my mother-in-law back to her own house when she started calling the neighbor's dog her grandson. Get enough evidence and the care facility will take them. Dementia speaks louder than skin color. Michael clenched his fists, the pressure building in his chest until he thought his heart might rupture. They had even shared images of Clara taken from behind as she swept the patio, walked through the grocery store alone, or sat hunched in the garden. One video clip showed her eating in silence. The caption read, She eats like she's waiting for scraps. Vanessa added, I'm tempted to edit this with some sad music and send it to Michael. He'd probably cry like a baby. Michael stopped reading. He couldn't take another word. He stood and walked out onto the balcony, staring down into the garden where Clara often sat in the late afternoons. She had endured all of this in silence, endured it because she didn't want to hurt him. And while she sat quietly, women dressed in designer clothes, dripping in jewelry, sipping wine and smiling for charity. Galas were breaking her spirit, piece by piece. Evil doesn't always wear sharp teeth. Sometimes it comes disguised as polite conversation, as a glass of Merlot on a linen-covered table, as laughter behind manicured hands. But it is evil all the same. And what chilled Michael even more than the cruelty itself was the complicity. A whole circle of women wives of powerful men, figures with influence, had watched it, knew it, even joined in, and not one had spoken up. Santa Barbara Prestige Circle. The name now pulsed on the screen like the brand of a secret society, one that knew how to polish its venom with status, wealth, and carefully curated public lives. Michael drew in a slow, deep breath. He knew what he had to do. This was no longer about him and Vanessa. It was no longer private. If this wasn't exposed, it would happen again. To someone else? To another Clara, another mother, grandmother, woman who had spent her life giving everything only to be reduced to a shadow in a home she helped build. Now, Michael would be the first to speak, not in rage, but with evidence, with truth, and with a voice that would not be silenced. A few days after uncovering the vile group chat, Michael began noticing the subtle shifts in Vanessa's behavior. Every glance, every word now carried calculation. Gone was the cold sweetness she once used to cloak her intentions. What replaced it was something far more brazen, a kind of open deceit so polished it bordered on mockery. Vanessa had begun to speak more frequently about Clara's mental health. She dropped comments during breakfast, in the car, even when popping into Michael's office with the excuse of bringing him food. One morning, she remarked, I've noticed Clara mumbling to herself a lot in the garden. It's like she's slipping back into the past. Another time, she casually left a brochure on his desk, a flyer for a care facility specializing in dementia. The headline, printed in bold, read, Comprehensive care, safe, loving, dignified. Michael saw it, but he didn't react. He let it all pass in silence because he was waiting to see the full shape of what Vanessa was planning. And it came. On a quiet Monday morning, Vanessa walked into his private office, holding a neat stack of papers, her expression a calculated blend of concern and persuasion. Honey, I know I shouldn't get involved in things like this, but I think it's time to do the right thing for everyone. Michael looked up, his eyes calm, unmoving like still water with depth you can't see. And the right thing is what? Sending my mother into a care facility? Vanessa blinked, caught slightly off guard by the bluntness, but quickly steadied herself. Her voice dropped into that gentle register she often used in social functions. I don't want to, but I've consulted with a specialist. If Clara is really showing signs of confusion, then leaving her in a house this big, especially when you're away for business, it's dangerous. She could fall. She might leave the stove on. What if something happened while no one was here? Michael nodded slowly, then reached out and took the folder she handed him. Inside was a guardianship petition. The listed guardian, Vanessa Reed. Below was a blank line waiting for Michael's signature. He flipped a few more pages. A signed agreement for admission to Valley Serenity, a luxury memory care facility with an annual cost nearing $100,000. The paperwork had already been filled out. All it needed was his consent. Were you planning to forge my signature, or just pressure me into signing it? His voice was even, almost too calm. Vanessa's composure wavered slightly. Her fingers tightened on the hem of her dress, but her tone remained soft. I just thought, if you're too busy to manage all this, letting me act as Clara's legal representative would make everything smoother. I'll take care of her. I love her like family. Michael didn't answer. He simply placed the folder aside, picked up his phone, and pressed a button. From the speaker, her voice played back word for word everything she had just said since stepping into the room. Every carefully chosen phrase, every subtle manipulation, clear as glass. Vanessa froze. You were recording me? The panic in her voice cracked through the performance. Are you spying on me now? You think I'd hurt her? Michael stood, walked to the door, then turned back to look at the woman he had once trusted, once welcomed into his life as something sacred. You didn't just betray my mother. You tried to wrap cruelty in the language of care. You're playing a game of law and perception, thinking I wouldn't know the rules. But you forgot one thing. The man you're playing against isn't a lost boy who needs his mother to protect him anymore. He's the man she raised, the one she taught how to read, how to see, and more importantly, how to recognize truth behind sweet-sounding lies. Vanessa stood still, hands gripping the fabric of her dress, her eyes darting between the unsigned guardianship form and the phone still resting on the desk. Michael walked out of the room. Behind him, sunlight poured in through the tall windows, landing squarely on the blank signature line of a document that now lay exposed, its false compassion plain for all to see. And somewhere in the quiet of the vast estate, Clara was folding laundry in the washroom, unaware that she had become the target of a plan cloaked in legal language and false concern. But Michael knew, and this time, he would not let anyone use the very systems he once escaped from to trap the woman who pulled him out of darkness. That day, after stepping out of the room where unsigned legal documents lay like traps waiting to be triggered, Michael sat alone in his private office. The window was open, and from where he sat, he could see the garden still touched by the soft gold of the afternoon sun, where Clara often read her books in quiet solitude. He picked up his phone without hesitation, without doubt, and dialed a number he had saved long ago, one he never thought he would need. The voice on the other end was calm, steady, and unmistakably experienced. Morales here. Michael drew in a slow breath. This is Michael Reed. I need your help, not as a businessman, as a son. 30 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up to the front gate of the estate. Morales stepped out with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. A former LA detective turned private investigator, he specialized in cases involving domestic abuse, financial manipulation, and legal fraud. Michael greeted him with a firm handshake and led him into the office, where the heavy curtains muted the late afternoon light. Without delay, he opened his laptop and began showing Morales everything. The audio recordings, the security footage, screenshots of the group messages between Vanessa and the Santa Barbara women, the unsigned guardianship papers, the plan to institutionalize Clara, bolstered by a falsified psychological assessment. Morales didn't interrupt. He listened, occasionally nodding, jotting notes in the weathered leather notebook he carried, its edges curled from years of use. When Michael finished, the older man closed the notebook, looked up, and his eyes were sharp as a blade. She's not just trying to get your mother out of the picture. She's building a false legal narrative to strip guardianship and legitimize cruelty. This isn't just manipulation, it's premeditated. And if I had to guess, she's not the first woman in that circle to do it. Michael nodded. I don't just want to stop her. I want to expose all of it, so that no one else, no mother, no elder, gets caught in a trap like this again. Morales leaned forward. We start with her devices. We need full backups of her phone and computer texts, emails, notes, logs, location data if possible. I need at least 2 hours where she won't be touching anything. Michael gave a small, bitter smile. Every Friday evening she leaves her phone charging in her dressing room while she gets ready for one of those charity dinners. I'll make sure she doesn't touch it. Morales nodded in approval, then added, I'll also have someone run through her financials. People like Vanessa. They get arrogant enough to leave fingerprints everywhere. Power and entitlement make them think they're untouchable. Michael's voice dropped low, steady as stone. She thinks I'll stay quiet out of pride. But I've learned from my mother that silence isn't always submission. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's waiting until the moment you strike and strike clean. Morales stood and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. You're not just a businessman. You're a son who knows how to fight the right way. And maybe now it's time someone reminded these women hiding behind pearls and pretense that justice doesn't only come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from the ones who survived because of truth. When Morales left, Michael turned once more toward the quiet space where Clara always made tea in the mornings, where she hummed softly as if time were still kind. Her eyes were still gentle, still full of grace, as they had always been since he was a child. But this time, he knew he was no longer the child in need of protection. Now, it was his turn to rise, not just to protect his mother, but to teach those who live behind privilege and pretend virtue a lesson they would never forget. That afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the canopy of the ancient oak tree in the garden behind the villa, Michael walked slowly toward the weathered wooden bench beneath its branches, where Clara had always sat each evening. She was there, her hands wrapped gently around an old woolen shawl, her eyes distant as they followed a flurry of sparrows flitting from branch to branch. He paused for a few moments, taking in that familiar figure. Through all the passing years, that image had never faded in his mind, not since the days when he was a lost little boy in an old wooden house somewhere in Alabama, and not even now, when he had become a successful businessman with a fortune worth many millions of dollars. Michael stepped closer and sat quietly beside her. They said nothing for a while. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the leaves and the soft chirping of birds mingling with the quiet sighs of time itself. At last he spoke, his voice low and firm. Mother, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. Clara kept her eyes ahead, never turning to him, but her voice was soft. Of course, my son. What is it you want to ask? Michael swallowed hard, then said, All this time when I was away, did Vanessa treat you badly? Still no direct gaze, only the wind passing gently over the shawl that trembled slightly on her shoulders. She hesitated. I think I didn't want to make you sad. Some things are better left unsaid. Michael turned, placing his hand over hers. But I know already, Mother. I've seen it. The cameras, the messages, the recordings. I can't stay silent any longer. Clara's eyes finally met her son's, eyes that had weathered a lifetime of sorrow now filled with tears. I never wanted you to have to choose between the woman you love and the old foster mother who raised you. I thought, if I endured it, it would eventually pass. But there were cold nights I will never forget. Leftover meals served chilled in the basement, words that tore into me, not because they were cruel, but because they came from the woman you once called your wife. Michael fell silent. His heart felt gripped in a vice. He remembered those nights in Tokyo, thinking his mother was at peace in the home he had built for her out of gratitude. But the truth was she had been huddled in a cold basement, alone, quietly enduring. Mother, I've never forgotten what you gave up so that I could have this life, and I will never forgive myself if I let anyone hurt you again. Clara smiled, a smile full of pain and warmth, the same as always. You owe me nothing, Michael. I did it all because I love you, not for anything in return. But she placed a hand on his chest, her eyes as if seeing into the deepest corners of his soul. If you choose now to protect me, remember this. Do it not out of anger, but out of justice. Michael nodded. I don't want revenge. I only want the truth to be seen. I want you to live your remaining years in peace and dignity, just as you deserve. And I want people like Vanessa to understand that cruelty, no matter how well dressed in fame and glamour, will always be exposed in the end. Clara gripped his hand. That is what I'm most proud of in you. Not the wealth, not the success, but the heart that always knows what is right. They sat there for a while longer, silent but deeply connected. The fading sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting its gentle glow upon the time-worn face of the aging mother and the face of a man once hardened by childhood pain, now softened by understanding. In that moment, no more words were needed. They both knew that a new chapter had begun, a chapter where Michael was no longer the child needing his mother's protection, but the man who would now protect her with everything he had. And that old wooden bench in the quiet garden was no longer just a place to rest, but the beginning of justice and an enduring love. The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept over the lavender hedges surrounding the villa, Michael was already seated in his study, a cold cup of coffee resting beside him. His eyes never left the laptop screen, where folders bearing the precise labels of evidence gathered by Detective Morales appeared one after another, sent after a sleepless night of investigation, messages, photographs, recordings, all meticulously organized by date, by topic, by level of severity. He placed his hand on the mouse, opening each file, watching each clip, and with every word read, every voice heard, the light in his eyes dimmed further into a steely coldness. It was no longer just about the insults hurled at his mother, but about something far more insidious, a cruel network of elite women in the Santa Barbara prestige circle, where Vanessa had become one of the most prominent figures. They laughed at the pain of others, spoke casually about discarding family members deemed unfit for their curated image, as if it were some elegant cleansing ritual reserved for the privileged. Michael understood now. This was no longer a personal wound. This was a system built on deception, protected by couture gowns, glittering fundraising galas, and names printed boldly across the glossiest pages of society magazines. But if Vanessa believed he would go on playing the role of the silent husband or the blind son, then this time she was terribly mistaken. He dialed Morales. The detective's voice, steady and ever ready, came through. "I need duplicate backups of all evidence uploaded to a private secure system. 2 copies, one for my attorney, one programmed for automatic release to the press should there be any interference from Vanessa or her associates." Morales replied it was already done, then added a detail. One of the former maids from the villa had reached out. She had been dismissed after speaking up about Vanessa's treatment of Clara. She was now willing to testify. Michael nodded. "Send me her information. I'll ensure she has legal protection and full exposure. Do you remember the charity gala this weekend?" Morales answered. "Of course. That will be where the masks come off." Michael pressed his lips together. "Exactly. I'm going to show all of Santa Barbara who the real woman is that deserves respect. And Vanessa will pay, not only for what she did to my mother, but for believing that reputation could buy silence." He also called his longtime attorney, Mr. Richards, a man who had stood by him for over a decade. Michael spoke briefly, but with unwavering resolve. "I want to begin divorce proceedings. The grounds are familial abuse, legal manipulation, and conspiracy to seize guardianship." Richards asked, "Do you want this quiet or public?" Michael replied, "Public. But not yet. Wait until after the gala. I want everyone to understand exactly why I made this decision. I'm not ending this marriage out of disappointment. I'm ending it for the sake of decency." Later that day, Michael visited Clara in the reading room, where she sat leafing through an old book he had gifted her back in his high school years. "Mother," he said softly, but his gaze held something new, something unshakable. "Now it's my turn to protect you." Clara didn't ask a thing. She simply looked at him, her smile full of trust. In that smile was both pride and peace, as if she had known all along that the boy who once cried after being bullied had finally become a man who not only knew success, but had the courage to face the truth. And from that day forward, every move Michael made was calculated with precision. Every smile he gave Vanessa was a silent farewell. Every nod at their public appearances was a step on the chessboard. And each night, as Vanessa left her phone to charge in the dressing room, Michael quietly backed up the latest data. Every message, every meeting scheduled with her personal lawyer, even her whispered conversations with other women from the group. Vanessa had no idea that the game she thought she was controlling had already turned against her. Nor did she suspect that the very charity gala she was so eagerly preparing for would mark the end of the false world she had spent years building, brick by merciless brick. That evening, Santa Barbara shimmered beneath the glow of hundreds of crystal chandeliers as luxury cars lined up one after another before the grand entrance of the annual charity gala hosted by the Coastal Patrons Society. It was a night everyone awaited eagerly, not merely for the cause of philanthropy, but for the unspoken competition of reputation, power, and the polished pretense of grace that the upper class had mastered so well. Vanessa arrived in a sapphire silk gown custom-tailored in Milan, her expression poised, her smile the result of rehearsals more meticulous than any speech. At her side was Michael, dressed in a simple black suit, radiating a quiet strength that was impossible to read. No one could see that behind that calm gaze lay a plan orchestrated with absolute precision. As they entered the grand hall, Vanessa tilted her head gently to greet each guest, her lips effortlessly delivering compliments, congratulations, and practiced charm, assuming her role as the evening's hostess with elegance. Michael merely offered a faint smile, speaking little. He let her perform, knowing every passing moment brought her closer to a reckoning she could not escape. The evening began with a video montage highlighting the philanthropic achievements of the past year. Vanessa stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand, her voice smooth as honey. She thanked the donors, spoke of compassion, of family values, and of gratitude for those who came before. Each word felt like a blade twisting into Michael's chest, for he knew this woman had never cherished any of the values she so eloquently preached. Applause followed. Vanessa beamed, but at that moment the lights in the hall dimmed. The screen behind the stage flickered, changing from the charity's emblem to the interface of a video feed. The room fell silent. Vanessa froze mid-step on stage, while Michael, seated in the front row, looked up without blinking. A voice spoke. "These are surveillance recordings from the estate of businessman Michael Reed over the past 3 months." The footage began. No narration was needed. Clara, huddled in the basement, clutching a tattered blanket, eating cold leftovers while above her, a lavish dinner party unfolded. Vanessa standing on the stairs, emotionless, tossing a birthday cake to the floor before turning away, leaving the old woman to kneel down and gather the broken pieces. Text messages appeared next, cruel and mocking, exchanged within the Santa Barbara prestige circle. Comments about Clara's skin, her age, her presence in the house. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Some women quietly left their seats. Others looked down in shame. Jennifer, Patricia, and others in the circle turned to Vanessa with faces stripped of any pretense of friendship. But it did not end there. The screen played a recording, Vanessa's voice clear and cutting. "I'll collect enough evidence to prove she's senile, put her in a facility, and erase that past from my house." She chuckled softly, as if recounting some idle gossip. When the audio ended, the lights returned. Vanessa stood frozen, her face drained of color. Every eye in the hall now fixed on her, not with admiration, but with disbelief, outrage, and quiet contempt. Michael rose from his seat and stepped onto the stage, taking the microphone from the stunned coordinator. He looked out over the room, then at Vanessa. "I have been silent for too long," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "And in that silence, the woman who raised me, who gave everything so that I could have a future, was humiliated, neglected, and scorned within the very walls I built to give her peace." Not a sound could be heard, only Michael's voice, steady and resolute, echoing through the vast hall. "Tonight, I'm not here just to raise money. I'm here to say that truth still matters, and those who use their status to harm the vulnerable, no matter how fine their silk gowns or how brilliant their diamonds, cannot hide who they truly are." He turned to Vanessa. "And you, the woman who was once my wife, will be held accountable. All evidence has been sent to my legal counsel, to the press, and to the authorities." A voice rose from the crowd. It was Mr. Richards, his lawyer. The divorce papers were filed this morning, along with charges of document falsification and elder abuse. Vanessa trembled, her eyes darting around the room in search of support, but every face that once stood with her had already stepped away. Not a single person came to her defense. Michael gave a polite nod to the audience, then turned and walked off the stage. As he passed Vanessa, he spoke quietly. There was no anger left in his voice, only a truth that could no longer be denied. The mask has fallen, and the one person you should never have underestimated was the woman I have always called Mother. The gala continued, but the spotlight was no longer on glittering prizes or polished auctions. The spotlight was on truth, and that truth, on this night, spoke loudly in the name of justice and the unconditional love of a son for the mother who had once given him everything. On the massive screen behind the stage, just after Michael stepped away from the microphone, a new stream of messages began to appear line by line, as if someone were typing them in real time. There was no background music, no more applause, only a thick, frozen silence that filled every corner of the grand hall. The first message was from Vanessa, posted in the Santa Barbara Prestige Circle group. Last night she tried to go upstairs again. She's clearly starting to lose her sense of direction. One of these days she'll forget the way to the bathroom. It's embarrassing. Beneath it were the echoing laughter and replies from other women in the group. Typical of those people. They never know their place, even at the end. Another chimed in. Vanessa, you're amazing. If it were me, I would have sent her back to the slums a long time ago. Vanessa had replied with a laughing emoji and a chilling follow-up. Don't worry, I'm building my case. A little confusion, a few times she forgets her son's name, some erratic behavior, and a couple photos. It's all I need to get her into a home, obviously one without Wi-Fi, the farther the better. Not a single sound moved through the room. Faces that had earlier lit up to greet Vanessa now stared at the screen in stone silence. Some guests began whispering, others stood quietly, as if unwilling to share a row with someone now fully exposed. But it didn't stop there. The screen shifted to a sequence of short videos, drawn from the security cameras inside Michael's estate. One clip showed Vanessa tossing Clara's sweater into the trash for being hung on the wrong hanger. Another, of Clara trembling as she stepped out of the basement on a freezing night, wearing nothing more than a thin scarf, only to retreat again at Vanessa's voice from upstairs. This floor isn't for that damp smell. Go back down where you belong. Then came footage of Vanessa on the phone with Michael while he was abroad. She's doing great, love. She's moved to tears. She says just having you is enough. And on a split screen, at that very moment, Clara sat alone in the basement, her face void of expression, a stale piece of bread in front of her, and an unopened birthday card resting on the table. The final clip was a recording of a conversation between Vanessa and her personal attorney. Her voice was cool, composed. I need the process to declare someone mentally unfit. We can use psychological grounds. I've got some accidental videos if needed. You know what I mean? The lawyer replied, as long as your husband signs, it can all be made legal. Vanessa's laugh followed, light and confident. My husband? He trusts me completely. When the video ended, the lights came back on. But Vanessa could no longer stand tall. Her knees buckled slightly, her hands shook, and her eyes darted around the room searching for something, anything to hold on to. But no one stood with her. Jennifer Walsh, once her closest ally, had turned away. Patricia Sterling, who had once cheered Vanessa for her vicious messages, now bowed her head in silent shame. Vanessa tried to descend from the stage, but each step felt burdened by the weight of 1,000 stairs. A few reporters had already stood, phones raised, cameras flashing without pause. One called out, Vanessa, do you have anything to say about the evidence that was just revealed? She didn't respond. Another followed. What's your comment on the accusations of elder abuse and falsifying medical records? Vanessa stood frozen, her carefully applied makeup now streaked with tears and sweat. Then her phone began to ring, over and over. One call from her attorney, another from the charity organization. Then a message popped up from a major fashion label announcing the termination of their partnership. She pulled out her phone, but the final blow came not from a stranger, but from her own mother. The screen showed a message from Gloria Martinez. It read, If you truly did those things, then never call me mother again. It was over. No announcement needed, no judge, no gavel. Vanessa had already condemned herself, undone by the very arrogance and cruelty she thought made her untouchable. Michael stood at the back of the hall, unmoved, not needing to approach. There was nothing left to say. The truth had spoken, and this time, it did not just strip away a mask, it dismantled an entire illusion crafted from cruelty and contempt. After that fateful night, everything crumbled faster than the perfect world Vanessa had spent years constructing. In less than 3 days, the story of a glamorous woman from Santa Barbara's elite unraveling behind closed doors blanketed newspapers across the country. From national television to every corner of social media, the footage exposing her cold and calculated cruelty toward Clara Jenkins, her husband's foster mother, was shared and replayed without end. The same photos that once showed her radiant on charity stages, speaking of compassion and giving, now appeared beside headlines that read, "A woman who donates millions to orphans but forces her mother-in-law to eat leftovers in a basement." That image alone shattered the admiration of an entire community, turning public favor into unforgiving condemnation. Michael gave no interviews. He allowed his lawyers to manage everything, with all official responses channeled through the legal office of Reed Innovations. The divorce filing was submitted the morning after the gala, accompanied by a formal petition to reclaim all jointly held assets on the grounds of elder abuse and medical fraud. Vanessa, once proud to declare that she had never signed a prenuptial agreement, confident that Michael would never invoke it, now had to confront the brutal truth that she had indeed signed every clause, believing he would never need them. But he did, and at exactly the right moment. Her name, Vanessa Martinez Reed, appeared across headlines from the New York Times to the Washington Post, on major news networks like NBC and CNN, as journalists dissected not just her actions, but the deeper cultural sickness she represented: performative morality among the wealthy, the illusion of status, and the cruelty that festers behind silk curtains and manicured smiles. Outraged comments flooded her social media profiles, eventually forcing her to shut down every account. Endorsements were pulled. The beauty brand she once championed dropped her as its ambassador. She was removed from the boards of 3 charitable foundations, stripped of invitations to high-profile events, and in the span of less than a week, Vanessa ceased to be anyone at all. Yet the most painful blow came not from strangers or the press, but from those she once called allies. The women of the Santa Barbara prestige circle, her circle, were swift to distance themselves. Jennifer Walsh publicly claimed in an interview that Vanessa had acted alone, and that the group was unaware of her plans to institutionalize Clara. Patricia Sterling went further, offering a televised apology to Michael's family, her voice trembling with remorse. Meanwhile, Vanessa sat alone in a modest rental apartment on the northern edge of the city, staring into a mirror that no longer reflected the woman who once swept into a $1 million mansion with an air of untouchable pride. Her designer gowns lay folded in half-open suitcases, forgotten. She had lost everything: not just wealth, not just position, not just prestige, but something more vital. She had lost respect, even from her own blood. Her mother, Gloria, had moved to live with the youngest daughter in Florida. In a short letter left behind, she wrote, "When you use someone else's pain to decorate your life in gold, you stop being the daughter I raised." Michael never looked back. His focus turned entirely to restoring peace to the home, bringing in doctors to assess Clara's health and ensure the emotional damage from months of abuse had not left lasting scars. Though Clara insisted she was fine, Michael insisted on hiring trauma specialists, experts who had worked with survivors of emotional and psychological violence. The villa in Santa Barbara underwent changes. New security systems were installed. Family photos, once removed, returned to the walls. Clara no longer lived in the basement, but was given the sunniest room upstairs, filled with light and greenery, complete with a little tea corner where she could read each morning in comfort. Michael remained silent before the press, but in a closed company meeting, he said just one thing. "None of us chooses where we come from, but we all choose how we protect the people who sacrificed everything for us." That single line was shared across the internet, echoing as a quiet manifesto for anyone who had ever loved someone not by blood, but by heart. And from that moment, Michael was no longer simply seen as a successful businessman. He became a symbol of gratitude, of quiet integrity, of a man who chose to speak truth to power inside his own home. As Vanessa collapsed beneath the weight of the world she had built on ego and pretense, Michael and Clara emerged from the shadows with nothing but compassion and unwavering love between them. And the fall of a fabricated world only served to illuminate more than ever the quiet, indestructible strength of kindness, a strength no scandal can ever defeat. 1 year after the events that once shook headlines across the nation, on a sunlit morning at a small community center in East Side Santa Barbara, a classroom buzzed with quiet excitement. 12 children sat at their desks, fingers dancing across keyboards, eyes wide with curiosity fixed on the smartboard at the front. Standing before them was a black woman with silver, threading her neatly tied hair, her voice warm yet steady with purpose. Clara Jenkins, now 68, was no longer the woman who once curled into herself in a cold, forgotten basement. She was now Miss Clara, the teacher who offered free programming lessons to underprivileged children in the neighborhood. The center, fully funded by Michael, bore her name, Jenkins Learning House. It was part of his larger promise not only to rebuild the quiet dignity of his mother's life, but to invest in the community she had always longed to serve. Clara stood in the center of the room, guiding her young students through their first lines of Python code. It was the same way she had once taught Michael, back when she worked night shifts as a nurse and read worn technology manuals by day, just to keep up with the dreams of her foster son. Each class began with a story meant to inspire. That day, she told them about a boy who was once called useless, who had drifted through the harsh system of foster care, but who learned to write code and went on to build an app that helped millions of people find work. The children's eyes lit up. One whispered, "That sounds like Mr. Michael." Clara smiled. "Because Mr. Michael was once a child just like you. Nothing is impossible if you have knowledge and kindness." The classroom, though modest, was fully equipped with computers, climate control, a smartboard, and a small library that Clara had personally curated. On the wall hung a painted portrait of her, surrounded by students. Beneath it were Michael's handwritten words. "Thank you, Mom. Because of you, I learned how to use intelligence to heal." Outside of her lessons, Clara also led forums on elder rights and emotional abuse within families. From the depth of her own past, she had become a voice for those once silenced people overlooked for their age, their color, or their social place. Women who had long suffered quietly behind the facades of influential families now sought her out like seekers of refuge, drawn to her strength and gentleness. Michael, after the divorce, lived more quietly, devoting his energy to his mother and to grassroots initiatives. He visited Jenkins Learning House most weekends, always sitting in the back of the classroom, listening without speaking, letting the children's laughter and questions fill the space. He never interrupted, never sought attention, only offering his mother a cup of Earl Grey tea with honey before taking his seat. Sometimes he simply watched her teach, filled with a gratitude so deep he knew he could never fully repay the life she had given him. The media no longer chased the remnants of Vanessa's scandal. Old headlines faded, and in their place grew a quieter narrative. Michael was now known not just as a successful entrepreneur, but as a man who had kept a childhood promise to protect those who had protected him. As for Clara, she never sought to be seen as heroic. For her, fulfillment came in watching once shy children grow bold enough to write their own code, their own futures. When asked if she hated Vanessa, she simply shook her head. "What good is hate," she said, "when you're living in the light?" That summer, a girl named Anaya from Clara's class won first place at the state science fair with a project that used artificial intelligence to assist elderly care. When she stepped on stage to accept her prize, she said, "I dedicate this award to Miss Clara, who taught me that technology is meant to connect hearts, not separate people." Clara sat in the audience, hands clasped, eyes shining with tears. In that moment, she had returned fully to the place where she belonged, a place where dreams are nurtured by compassion, where people live to pass on hope rather than bury pain. And that light, gentle as the smile she gave Michael each morning, was no longer rare or unreachable. It was the quiet, luminous result of a life lived with unconditional love. One late autumn afternoon, inside the quiet warmth of Jenkins Learning House, Michael stepped into the classroom where his mother was teaching. He quietly took his usual seat on the wooden chair tucked into the corner of the room, letting her voice wrap around him like an old melody. That day, Clara wasn't teaching syntax or algorithms. She was telling a story with no heroes by name, yet one full of quiet bravery. There are moments, she said gently, when staying silent is the easiest thing to do, because speaking up may cost you everything. But if what you're protecting is the truth, if you're standing on the side of compassion, then you will gain something far more valuable than any reward. You will find peace in your soul. The children listened closely. One raised a hand. "Miss Clara, how do we know when it's time to speak up?" She smiled, her eyes drifting softly as if they could see back through the years. "When someone you love is being hurt, when truth is crushed beneath pretense, when kindness is mistaken for weakness, that's when you must step forward, not with anger, but with steadiness and wisdom." Her words lingered, not just within the four walls of that small classroom, but deep in Michael's chest. He thought of the boy he once was, bullied in school, coming home in tears to a woman who wiped his face and taught him that strength isn't in who shouts the loudest, but in who knows when to speak. He remembered the mother who had lived quietly her whole life, asking for nothing but the chance to raise her son into a man of dignity. And now, her voice wasn't only a lullaby or a warm meal. It had become a lantern, guiding a generation forward. This story is a reminder for all of us that love, kindness, and gratitude are not signs of weakness. On the contrary, they are the deepest forms of strength. The strength to face what's hard, to raise your voice when it matters, to protect what is sacred. In a modern world where moral values are so often drowned beneath the noise of ambition, simply being able to say thank you, to stand up for the person who once held you through the dark, to speak truth within your own home, may require more courage than any public victory. And perhaps that is the quiet but powerful message that remains from the story of Michael and his mother, Clara Jenkins. If you've made it this far, we want to hear from you. Did this story remind you of someone in your life? Have you ever felt overlooked or dismissed, yet chose to rise with kindness instead of bitterness? Share your thoughts in the comments below so that we, in the Emotional Echoes community, can listen, reflect, and walk with you. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it. Every share helps bring this message to someone who may be quietly going through something similar and looking for the strength to speak. At Emotional Echoes, we're here every day to bring you stories that are raw, human, and deeply moving. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this video. We wish you and your loved ones strength, calm, and joy in each day. Until next time, may you always live in the light of kindness and love.